Good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this evening seminar on the history of diabetes to commemorate the recent centenary of the discovery of insulin. Just a few housekeeping issues before we start. People, you're all turned onto mute, and I don't think you can change that. When we get to the end and we have questions, you can either put up your hand and speak and we can take you off mute, or you can put your questions in the chat button. I would ask if people don't use the chat box while our two speakers are speaking. The pop-ups can be quite distracting for both those in the audience and also the speakers themselves. So if you have a question or a comment, please write it down on a piece of paper or type it into your phone and then put it up at the end. We'll have two speakers this evening, and then we'll have time for, and we'll have both the speakers, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. If you're struggling with bandwidth, please turn off your cameras as well, as that can often help with bandwidth and being able to hear what's going on. Okay, so I should like to begin by introducing our two speakers this evening. Dr. Martin Moore completed his PhD at the University of Warwick in 2014, after which he joined the University of Exeter as part of the project Lifestyle, Health and Disease, Concepts of Balance in Modern Medicine. This research has provided the basis for an edited volume, Balancing the Self, Medicine, Politics and Regulation of Health in the 20th Century, which is a Manchester University Press from 2020, which he co-edited with Mark Jackson, who's also at Exeter. And Martin's first monograph, Managing Diabetes, Managing Medicine, also Manchester University Press in 2019. And this book traced new forms of chronic disease management developed in the post-war period and intersected with projects for managing medical professionals in the new NHS. He's currently working on two projects. The first is a Wellcome collaborative trust on the history of time and care in post-war British general practice, and tentatively titled Hurry Up and Wait, which I think is a fabulous title. Thank you, Martin. I hope you go with it. And the second, which forms part of his work as lecturer in medical history at the Wellcome Centre for Culture and Environments of Health at Exeter, is a history of commuting and well-being in the late 20th century. If you travelled on Northern Rail, you would know there's no well-being. Our second speaker is Tom Rush. Tom is a retired nurse and lecturer and now chairs Diabetes UK Research Committee in Northern Ireland. He also raises awareness of diabetes in his local community. Tom was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes 12 years ago and has volunteered ever since. He's recently got the good news that his diabetes is in remission. Well done, Tom. And Tom says, volunteering at Diabetes UK means an awful lot to me. It's a big part of my life. I feel valued by the people I've worked with, staff, fellow volunteers, researchers and clinicians. If you're interested in volunteering, then go for it. It really benefits you and you're helping others affected by diabetes too. So I'm very much looking forward to listening to these two speakers. But before I do, in collaboration with those people in Ukraine who are suffering unimaginable horrors of war, there are diabetes organisations that work outside the borders of this country. It's not just Diabetes UK. And Sarah or Francis are going to put into the chat box the URLs of two diabetes organisations that are working to support people in Ukraine who have diabetes at this time. So if you're able or want to help, then please click on those two URLs. Okay, so without further ado, my very warm welcome to Martin Moore, and we will have both speakers before questions, please. So Martin, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane, for that very generous introduction, and to the college for the chance to speak today. I'm just going to quickly share my screen so I can put some slides on, and I'm also going to set a timer to make sure I don't run too wildly over time. Okay, so as we've just heard, this year does mark the centenary for the first clinical use of insulin therapy for patients with diabetes. As this selection of film posters, books, stamps, and even tweets suggest, the events surrounding these remarkable innovation have been widely celebrated and dramatized over the past 100 years. They've also generated considerable historical attention, including claims that insulin was actually discovered far earlier than widely thought. Now, at the risk of disappointing some of you, I will not be addressing these admittedly fascinating debates today. Rather, I want to use my talk to explore how less radical shifts in diabetes management have been experienced within specific historical contexts. That is, I will ask, how has diabetes management been shaped by shifting cultural values, economic structures, healthcare systems, political projects, and forms of social organisation in Britain over the past 100 years? Now, to do this, I'm going to offer what we might think as two snapshots of British diabetes care in the 20th century. So firstly, I'll look at early uses of insulin during the 1920s and 30s, decades within which a nascent welfare state was developing alongside new treatments for diabetes itself. Secondly, I will trace the ways in which collective forms of medical provision flourished in the 1950s and 1960s, decades within which the material and social conditions of self-care were remade. I'll then almost certainly run out of time, so I'll conclude very briefly by situating the historical in relation to today. Now, particularly in section 2, I will consider how familial responsibilities around diet could create shared experiences of care for people with different types of diabetes. And most of the materials I use for this are from a remarkable oral history project undertaken at the University of Oxford about 15 years ago. It's hosted at this event, at this address, and I'd strongly recommend anybody who's interested to take a look at the website. However, it is important to recognise that it was only in the 1980s that clinicians began to refer to type 1 and type 2 diabetes, which in turn raises questions over how definitions of diabetes have changed over time. Now, this could easily be the topic of the whole session. Historians like Arlene Tuchman have noted that cultural, economic, social and political anxieties have persistently shaped medical and public understandings of the condition. However, at the a risk of massive oversimplification, it might be useful to keep in mind a few key changes in clinical knowledge that took place over the period I'm discussing. So it was during the early 20th century that diabetes was reconceived as a metabolic disturbance diagnosed by persistently raised levels of blood glucose. By the 1920s, doctors increasingly understood this state to result from one of two problems. Either the patient's body was unable to produce enough insulin, or it had become resistant to insulin's effects. And between the 1930s and 1950s, clinical teams saw a growing array of long-term complications associated with diabetes, from kidney and nerve damage to blindness and cardiovascular disease. Now, the emergence of these complications did raise important questions about treatment that I won't have time to talk about in the actual paper, but I'd be happy to discuss afterwards if people are interested. However, by and large, throughout this period, doctors sought to use a mix of dietary treatment and insulin to restore patients' health and to reduce blood glucose to near normal levels. In terms of types, clinicians had long subdivided their patients into two broad camps. On the one hand, there were patients generally under 30 who experienced sudden weight loss, extreme thirst and hunger, and frequent urination, who were often liable to coma and to death, sometimes within a matter of months. On the other hand, there were persons who were generally older, heavier, who had experienced milder symptoms and who might live for years after diagnosis following strict dietary treatment. However, despite the shifting changes in terminology which I've outlined on the slide, after the 1920s, doctors essentially divided their patients into two groups, those who needed insulin and those who did not. And as it was this pragmatic division which often had the greatest impact on patient experience, that's the one I'm going to follow in my talk. Okay, so to the 1920s. Injectable insulin was, to quote one historian, one of medicine's most remarkable therapeutic triumphs of the 20th century. To some extent, its early impact could be quantified in terms of life expectancy. So as we can see on the slide, life expectancy for patients following a diagnosis doubled between the 1910s and 1930s, from 6 to 12 years. And this extension was even more stark for children, tripling over the same period. Crucially, though, sort of these figures and tables like it excluded those patients who remained alive, sometimes for decades after their diagnosis. And perhaps insulin's biggest impact was, in fact, cultural, offering hope to patients and families that diabetes was no longer what they considered a death sentence. And yet, as Chris Feutner has noted, insulin's triumph was bittersweet. Together with other therapeutic innovations, insulin changed diabetes as a biological and social entity. It became what Feutner has called a disease in motion. So its potentially catastrophic short-term consequences remained, only now they were joined by the risk of slowly developing complications and the demands of a kind of unceasing care work from patients, family, and healthcare professionals. In Britain, this daily labour gradually replaced long stays in hospitals over the 1920s. So upon diagnosis, people with diabetes would now have short periods of admission to medical institutions in which they would receive education and have a treatment patterns established aimed at reducing their blood sugars. Once discharged, if they lived in a major city with a specialist outpatient clinic, patients might then be placed under hospital responsibility and seen every 3 to 6 months for monitoring. Outside of these visits, though, patients were charged following their regimen, unaided. So regimes varied, but generally they involved the following repetitive and often quite painful, messy and boring daily tasks. So there'd be careful planning of diet via diet sheets and weighing food, insulin injections, usually before breakfast and an evening meal, but sometimes up to 4 times a day. There'd be twice daily urine testing, which was a proxy for blood glucose tests. And it was, as this sort of advert suggests, a fairly tricky process of slowly heating urine samples and then adding chemicals to them, often above a kitchen stove rather than a Bunsen burner, as you might see there. And finally, there was a role of maintaining and sterilizing equipment such as needles and syringes to minimize the risk of infections. Now, some people recalled these tasks becoming quickly mere routine, even as one patient recalled fitting unconsciously into daily life. By contrast, others experienced this self-care as difficult and as an unwelcome reminder of illness. Diagnosis provided what some scholars have called a painful biographical disruption, leading patients to, in the words of this patient, disobey rules and stretch the limits of their regimen. Rarely, though, did a complete rejection of this self-care provide relief. As one patient recalled in 1938, for all the fun I had, eating as they pleased and performing no tests, I might as well have gone to prison for a year. I worried all the time and I enjoyed nothing I did. Now, as Stuart Bradwell has shown in his fantastic PhD, patients on insulin have always been creative with their treatment. For some, this amounted to small adjustments, for instance, reducing their insulin if they were planning on activity like mowing the grass in the case of this patient. A minority, by contrast, went considerably further. They constantly adjusted their diet, insulin, and physical activity to work around their life, and they maintained what they, rather than what their doctors saw, as acceptable levels of control. Indeed, as Bradwell has suggested, as well as other scholars like Christiane Sinding, the newly chronic nature of diabetes care highlighted tensions. On the one hand, between paternalistic values of medicine, in which experts set out instructions to be followed, and the lived reality of patients, who often possessed their own ideas of good care and who required autonomy to negotiate their everyday life. Now, patient struggles against diets in particular were perhaps unsurprising. Treatment at this time generally pegged carbohydrate intake to a fixed insulin allowance. And as importantly, particularly in the 1920s, treatment was often shaped by conservative Christian values of thrift and restraint, moral norms which were widespread among Britain's middle classes. Some doctors, for instance, in this case, condemned the unnecessary employment of insulin to obtain luxuries. And they noted that slight undernutrition teaches the body economy, making it easier to achieve normal blood sugars. They prescribed punishing low-calorie, low-carbohydrate diets, some as low as 25 calories per kilo, so around 1,600 calories for a 10-stone patient. More generous allowances might be made if the patient, for instance, a manual worker, but the proportions of fat and protein to carbohydrate still pose difficulty. So this patient recalled their diet, which was a fairly generous 2,500 calories, but consisted of only 34 grams of carbohydrate. And as they said, you try spreading 3 to 4 ounces of butter and 1 ounce of bread. Now, into the 1930s, clinical teams gradually recognized some of the social and psychological difficulties of these early regimes. They stopped, for instance, suggesting that patients weigh their food, and they increased insulin prescriptions to allow for greater levels of carbohydrate. Such changes, they noted, could make patients happier mentally and less conspicuous socially. And the latter was not insignificant when the diagnosis risked someone's job or pension. Nonetheless, these changes had limits. So the rigidity of meal times and insulin remained central parts of regimen, and tensions between patients and doctors over quality of life in chronic care rumbled on. Now, to some extent, falling insulin prices did facilitate broader therapeutic change. So in 1923, a single dose of insulin cost almost 5% of the average weekly wage for a semi-skilled worker. But state regulation and mass production quickly reduced this cost by around 75% within several years. These changes, though, did not eradicate the age, class, and gender inequalities in healthcare that shaped how innovations might be taken up. So as this poster on the left is suggesting, liberal reforms during the early 20th century had created a nascent welfare state for the working class, one funded by national insurance contributions of worker, employer, and state. This meant that employed working age people with diabetes could access GPs and insulin prescriptions through the national insurance scheme, though they still face charges for blood testing. Such access could be a literal lifeline, considering that specialist clinics did not provide insulin directly. National insurance was, however, predicated on the idea of what Jane Lewis has called the male breadwinner. So working class women were eligible, but social and economic norms meant that they were often forced out of work upon marriage. And within a family unit, insurance would cover the working man, but not their so-called dependents. So generally spouses, children, and elderly and unemployed relatives outside of formal work. Equally, unemployment, such as during periods of instability, also removed formal rights to care after time. For people with diabetes, discrimination meant that retaining a job itself could be difficult if a diagnosis became known. And for those without access to national insurance, families would have to either pay private fees, rely on the charity of doctors, face the stigma of the poor law, or, as this letter on the left suggests, appeal to public health authorities for support. For the middle classes, greater means could mean greater access to private treatment. But across the board, great variations in income ensured great variations in expertise, drugs, and self-care equipment. Patients' treatment, according to one GP, had to be, to quote, commensurate with their means rather than their needs, and that introduced severe inequalities in care. Now, to some extent, the arrival of universal healthcare and the social democratic welfare state in 1948 removed many of these formal inequalities. There were, of course, important therapeutic developments during these decades, not least the invention of oral hypoglycemic agents. But nonetheless, perhaps the most significant innovation was political and organizational. The NHS removed anxieties and many inequalities around drugs and self-care equipment, and it provided the foundation for expanded expertise, specialist expertise in diabetes care. Experiments with care teams also emerged during these decades that would become standard features of later landscapes. For instance, the first specialist diabetic nurses and health visitors were trained in the 1940s and 1950s. And as this patient attested, their greater availability and expertise relative to GPs were highly valued in the few places that they were employed. Of course, inequalities were not obliterated overnight. So-called quote-unquote diabetic diets were still often unaffordable for elderly and poorer patients. And doctors were beginning to realize that the very content of dietary prescriptions had often been derived from the norms of white British and middle-class families. They had, in the words of one leading consultant, no recognition that few working-class families had 2 cooked meals a day, as an example. The sort of mentioning of the family here is also telling. It was a recognition that diabetes self-management often involved other people. As we can see in this quote, relationality was not much reflected in leading patient handbooks of the time, which continue to offer what we might call individualist and masculine values derived from Victorian, industrial and imperial society. The diabetic life, this doctor suggested, demands self-control from its subject, but it gives in return a full and active existence with no privations. It required only a little intelligence and some determination. Now we could dig deeper into the moral subtext here, I think, which implicitly related poor health to ignorance of instruction and an irresponsible lack of self-governance. However, as important were the ways that assertions also overlooked how whole families were often enrolled in diabetes care and how responsibilities were structured by social and political expectations about gender roles. So, for instance, children of parents with diabetes in post-war years recalled not just rigid meal times and absent foodstuffs such as Bisto, but also responsibilities for managing their patient's hypoglycemia. And as this patient mentioned here, this could get quite difficult, for a 4 or 5-year-old with an increasingly aggressive and stroppy parent. Post-war economics and welfare, as well as family life, that is, were also still highly structured around breadwinner models of male work and female domestic labour. So it meant that when spouses were also involved in care, this was not necessarily in a reciprocal fashion. This was particularly the case when it came to dietary management, where women still assumed disproportionate responsibility. As one interviewee reflected, for instance, his wife had always prepared the beans for his special pulse diet, arranging them in a way that he only had to weigh them out for his meals and add them to his casseroles. Or as another interviewee put it more bluntly, she, his wife, usually does the food and knows what I am eating. This was not work that was generally reciprocated by husbands of people with diabetes, though. One husband recalled that his wife had been diagnosed in 1960, but it was only after she suffered a liver problem and was prescribed insulin in the 1990s that he developed what he called an attention to what was happening. His efforts to, quote, become more helpful did not entail daily dietary labour so much as surveilling and logistics. So he would constantly prompt his wife to take blood sugar tests or make sure that their holiday locations had the facilities to store her insulin. Of course, other husbands were more involved, and they often helped out with injections or urine testing. And equally, as this interviewee attests, husbands might feel guilty if their wives prepared separate meals for the rest of the family. So he resolved to estimate what he called his rations from a main meal to spare her extra labour. Nonetheless, the type of care offered here remained patterned in gendered ways across this period, with diet generally just deputed to women. This interviewee's experiences, however, were notable for raising questions about cultural norms. His journey from...
Martin, you have a couple of minutes left.
Okay, great, thank you. His journey from a British colony to Britain was increasingly common in the post-war decades as Britain turned to its empire and Commonwealth to address its labour shortages. This included many healthcare workers who tirelessly worked in the face of racist discrimination to enable a universal NHS to function. Asked whether his dietary prescriptions were tailored to Caribbean cuisines, he noted that they were, and suggested that they offered nutritional values for yams and rice, for instance. But this was not the case for everybody, and different migrants from different parts of the empire had different experiences, such as this nurse who migrated from Singapore to Bristol in the 60s, who noted missing their rice at first and having to eat mainly potatoes before adapting their own diet. And there were other sources of advice, such as the Journal of the Diabetic Association, which also remains predominantly focused on European fare. It was not until the 1980s and 90s that health departments and organisations like the BDA began to routinely translate guidance on diabetes and diet into language other than English. all the NHS diabetes services began to rework how they operated to address stark disparities for working class and racialized minority patients. And this formed part of wider critiques of health policy and health systems, which sought to shift discussions about inequalities away from culture and victim blaming toward environment understandings of how racism, economics, and exclusionary healthcare environments could structure poor health. And as work on COVID and diabetes has shown in the last few years, these are issues which are still very much alive and with us today. So to conclude, as we're no doubt about to hear from Tom, much has changed in diabetes care since the decades I was discussing. Values of patient autonomy and empowerment, for instance, have become central to self-management, and patients are increasingly encouraged to adapt their treatment to individual needs. As I hope this talk has allowed us to see, though, such arrangements are themselves historical. Innovations in technology and insulin have, of course, facilitated these trends. But as Stuart Bradwell has argued, they've also emerged out of ongoing tensions between doctors and patients and political trends towards market individualism and consumerism since the 1970s. So whether past or present, systems of care reflect not just scientific knowledge and technological capacities, but also the broader cultural values, politics, economics, and social organizations of contemporary societies. Diabetes care, I hope I've shown in this sense, is something unique, but also reflective of healthcare more broadly. So sorry for overrunning, and thank you for your time and for listening.
Thank you, Martin. And I think we'll move just swiftly on to Tom now.
Okay. Hello, I'm Tom Rush, and hello from Belfast, which was a little damp and windy today. It's usually very sunny and warm, mind you. Anyway, have I got my first slide up, Jim? Yeah. Or Sarah, thank you very much. And just before my general introduction, I want to insert a little preamble. So can I have the next slide up here? I think there are I think 4 historical events which have shaped my experience of my diabetes, and this is them. And the discovery of insulin, of course, in 1922, which we're celebrating or just celebrated this year, is a really important one. I have type 2 diabetes and haven't yet needed insulin. But the discovery of insulin opened up an all-encompassing interest in the broader study of diabetes. And some recent studies, for example, have suggested that there are many types of diabetes rather than just the one that Martin referred to earlier with mild, severe, mild, and medium, as it were. I have no doubt that a cure for diabetes will emerge at some time. The second one was the founding in 1934 of the Diabetic Association, called the DA, later the British Diabetic Association, and now Diabetes UK. Some of you may know, some of you may not know that H.G. Wells was a founder of the Diabetic Association. He had type 2 diabetes, which of course wasn't called type 2 then, he had mild diabetes. And he was being treated by a doctor called Dr. R.D. Lawrence, and he had type 1 diabetes. So he had got an interest in diabetes from that point of view. Dr. Lawrence developed his diabetes, type 1 diabetes, in 1922, just after the discovery of diabetes, or around that time. He was 28 years old then, and clearly his life was saved by the discovery of insulin. The two became friends and jointly set up the Diabetic Association to campaign for free insulin for all people living with diabetes. And we wouldn't have, I think, the Diabetes UK charity that we have now if it wasn't for those two men at that stage. The third one was, of course, the NHS 1948, and it had been in gestation for many years before it became available in July 1948. 2 world wars and the Great Depression had delayed its arrival, and Aaron Bevan, in the face of much opposition, introduced it and said in his speech to Parliament, "A time of revolution in the world's history is a time for revolution." I presume he meant in healthcare. Wells and Lawrence, incidentally, had campaigned vigorously for the NHS because they knew it was the only way that every person living with diabetes would get the treatments and be able to afford the treatment. Well, because they couldn't afford the treatments they needed. And the fourth issue was a very personal event that happened in round about 2007, maybe a wee bit before it. There was a revision in the blood glucose levels for diagnosing type 2 diabetes. And I'll speak a little bit more about this later on. So can I have the next slide then, please? And this just sets out really what I'm going to try to do in this little presentation. And the main thrust of my involvement is to talk about the Diabetes UK Northern Ireland Research Partnership, which comes under the volunteer part. The vision of Diabetes UK at the minute is to create a world where diabetes can do no harm. So if I can introduce myself then as a person, just very briefly, I'm nearly 74 years young. I was born just before the NHS came into being in 1948. You'll wonder why I'm giving a wee bit of a personal thing here, but I think you'll understand it when I finish it. I was the sixth child to working class parents, and two of my siblings died in infancy before I arrived. I am convinced from what I've heard that they would not have died if they'd been born after the NHS had been available to look after them. They, from what I hear, they had really quite ordinary diseases, simple things that would have been easily treated with a national health service. But there wasn't that then, and they died in infancy from what we would consider very mild diseases now. However, I had good health as a child, perhaps because of the NHS, and adult through to my late 50s. So then me as a nurse, so I can introduce that, why nursing is a career choice. A lot of female nurses say that their mother was a nurse, or their sister was a nurse, or their aunt, or maybe even Florence Nightingale. Funny enough, my older brother was a nurse, and that's why I trained. He was much older than me. He was the eldest in the family, and I was the youngest. So he was really a young adult whenever I was around about 10, 11, 12, 13, beginning to think about what I was going to do. And he had become a nurse, a mental nurse, as they were called in those days, probably trained around about the mid-50s. And from my point of view, he seemed to have a lot of time off. Of course, he was doing shifts and so on, so he'd be off during the week when other people would be working. I didn't realize that. But he seemed to have a lot of time off. And he also seemed to have a good income. He was dressed well. He seemed to have a good time. He had motorcycles and cars and all the rest of it. So I hadn't done as well in my O levels, unfortunately, and I couldn't train as an architect, which is what I wanted to do. So mental nursing was for me too. So I trained as a mental nurse also between 1966 and 69. I married a nurse, and we both left Northern Ireland and travelled to Northampton General Hospital, where I was, I think, the second male nurse to train there. And while there, I developed an interest in operating theatre nursing, and meant we moved to Birmingham in around about 1971 or 72, I think it was, 72. And I took an operating theatre course for state registered nurses in Birmingham Hospital. I'll shorten this a little bit by saying that I did return to Northern Ireland to a hospital, a newly built hospital in Craigavon called Craigavon Area Hospital. I'd been offered an operating theatre charge nurse's job there as a result of my training in Birmingham. And my wife really wanted to return home. I could have happily stayed in Birmingham, but I've no regrets about our decision to return to Northern Ireland. So I had some years' experience in the operating theatre, and then was a charge nurse in the general medical ward. And I'm sure some of you will say, my goodness, that's some change. Well, I wanted to be a tutor, and I needed to do that to increase the range of my experience that I had. So I worked as a tutor and a senior tutor in schools of nursing until I joined the RCN and spent over 25 happy years there until I retired in 2013. So I worked for the Institute of Advanced Nursing education in the RCN for many years. If we can move on then to me as a person living with diabetes. And I don't know whether you're all familiar with the term person living with diabetes. It's a sort of a modern thought, that people don't like. Some people don't like to be labeled with a disease, as it were. So a lot of people objected to being called a diabetic. I personally have no great problem with it, but I respect it and respect the thinking behind it. So in 2007, after a relatively healthy young and middle-aged life, I attended a well-man clinic with my GP and was absolutely gobsmacked when he called me back in a week's time and told me that my blood sugar level was up. So we did another one. And to cut a long story short again, he told me that my blood sugar level was up and my cholesterol level was up, and I had type 2 diabetes. And this is going back to the point I made earlier about 2007. I was later to learn that actually the blood glucose level for diagnosis of type 2 diabetes had just before that been changed, had been revised downwards. So I probably was picked up when I was in quite an early stage. I didn't have any signs or symptoms. I didn't have any problems. There was nobody in my family that I knew of then had diabetes, although my older sister developed it a few years after I did. So I was referred to a diabetologist who made it clear to me that this was a very serious disease and I had to take it very seriously. And I did that. And I thought that she gave me very good advice and so on. And not all healthcare professionals at all sorts of areas of practice were as well informed about particularly type 2 diabetes as the people that I had. But I think most healthcare professionals are now well informed. And anyway, to cut a long story short, I took my diabetes very seriously. I reviewed my food intake, both the quality and the volume. I reduced my carbohydrates and fats and my portions. Using a smaller plate for dinner, really does work. I also walked up to 6 miles a day. My weight and waist reduced significantly. The experts in diabetes have told us clearly that the problem with being overweight is carrying it in the waist, which of course I had started to carry a little bit of extra weight in my late 50s. I was probably about a stone overweight. I wasn't obese, and my BMI was 25.5, which is just above the normal rate. And the anxiety that diabetic specialists have is that the weight that people usually gathers in the belly and the abdomen. And that seems to indicate that there's a lot of fat around the liver and the pancreas, and this impairs functioning of that. Anyway, when I did all of my walking and restricting my diet and so on, I did lose quite a lot of weight. In fact, probably a bit too much. After some time, when I spoke to some of my colleagues and friends about my diabetes, they told me that they had noticed that I had lost a lot of weight. And in fact, some of them said that they thought I had cancer because I'd lost so much. So I probably had lost a little bit too much, and I eased up a little bit and sort of regained the figure and the weight and so on that I had in my 40s. And I've remained in that sort of area ever since. Put a few pounds on in the pandemic, but I'm still within recommended limits. Most importantly, my blood sugar levels reduced significantly. I was given a blood sugar target of 6.5, and I did achieve that very quickly, and I've maintained it. And so my HbA1cs have been below 6.5% or 48 millimoles per mole since quite early on in my journey. Non-diabetic levels are between 4 and 5.6, and a HbA1c of 6.5% or 48 millimoles or below for 6 months without medication indicates remission. I'll just come back to that in a moment or two, but it's not a cure because higher levels of blood sugar may return. However, maintaining near normal levels of blood sugar contribute to less complications and severity of complications. And the DIRECT trial, which some of you may have heard about, is collecting data on this. Remission is a recent description of what some people with type 2 have achieved on a large trial funded by Diabetes UK and led by Professor Roy Taylor in Newcastle and Professor Michael Lean in Glasgow. The study is called DIRECT, Diabetes Remission Clinical Trial. The results so far are very good, and remission trials have rolled out across the NHS. The essential findings seem to suggest that the reduction in body weight, and especially the reduction in abdominal fat, is a key issue. They note, mind you, the researchers, that because type 2 diabetes is a complex disease, this trial may not offer remission for everyone. It's also quite a hard one because the early reductions in food intake are quite severe. However, also the early results are very encouraging for those who do respond. So now I'm going to move on to me as a volunteer with Diabetes UK. When I was diagnosed, I realized that I had not had any clinical contact with people living with diabetes since my very early training and practice as a staff nurse. Mostly that would have been about testing the urine of newly admitted patients with multi-sticks. You remember those? They were a catch-all test for several diseases. And occasionally we picked up people which was then called maturity onset diabetes. I think Michael mentioned that earlier on. I don't recall very much fuss being made about most of them unless their glucose levels were very high, and some of them would then have had a glucose tolerance test. Most would have been put on a low carbohydrate diet, and their bread and potatoes would have been measured and restricted, and sugar and sweets and cakes would be banned. When I was diagnosed...
Tom, you've got 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. I should be okay for that. Thank you. I became aware of Diabetes UK as being a member organisation who wanted to include people with diabetes and so on. So I made inquiries about doing that and became a volunteer. And in my early days, I was working very much as, if you would put up the next slide, I think it is, please. The volunteer activities were presentations to lay groups, all sorts of groups, sports groups, community groups, all sorts of people like that, first aid groups, speaking to healthcare practitioners, and nurses, pharmacy students, and anyone who takes an interest. I was in meeting, in fact, on Friday with medical students in Queen's University, Belfast. And we also occasionally speak to local politicians. We call them our MLAs, Member of Local Assembly, on special diabetes events. The pinnacle of the work, I think, is what we do in the Diabetes Research Partnership. This was set up in 2015 by a professional advisor with Diabetes UK in Northern Ireland. And she got a number of us together. She put out a general email to people, and there were a number of us expressed interest. And one of the big issues that was around then was what was called personal and public involvement. And this had been introduced after the report of the Bristol Royal Infirmary report. This had been introduced to encourage researchers and clinicians and so on, and scientists, to involve people with particular diseases in research and so on into their diseases and into their care. It's a de facto requirement for ethical and funding approvals, and will probably soon become a legal requirement. Anyway, gone are the guinea pig days when human subjects in medical projects and trials are not informed and did not give their permission for research on the persons. The horror stories of the past, and some of these activities should not occur now. So we were set up by Florence, and the reasons were that good research will benefit the care available to people living with diabetes. and researchers were seeking the endorsement of Diabetes UK for their funding applications and ethical approval, and there was the PPI involvement. We were prepared for a role by attending an appreciation course in research by the Public Health Agency. And we became involved in writing patient information leaflets, consent documents, and suggesting additional areas of inquiry and research. Some of us have served on trial steering committees. I was on a major UK retinopathy trial steering committee recently, which finished and reported last year, and has recommended some significant positive implications for the treatment of retinopathy. Many of our members have served on advisory panels and committees, and we've all report that we've all been made feel welcome, involved, and make a difference. And I just want to finish off with, I think it's the next slide, is it? We did a little survey. No, I want to move on from that one. We did a little survey. I had planned something that would have been a bit more than what we actually did, but then the pandemic interfered with it. I was thinking about it the year before the pandemic, and it was to celebrate this year as the anniversary of 22. But anyway, it became a much smaller survey. There were 23 respondents. It was an online survey, ages 18 to 64 plus, and there were general questions about their experience of diabetes. And I think there's another slide, and that will be the last one. One of the questions was about the first signs of diabetes, and mothers of children were often quoted as noticing the 3 Ps of diabetes: polydipsia, polyuria, and polyphagia. There was also a person who said that it was her boyfriend that noticed her going to the toilet and all the rest of it. And another one said it was her husband that noted that. So I think there's another one as well, please. Another slide. The effects of diabetes, they were varied. Some said they were very good, but unfortunately, one marriage was broken up as a result of it. And I think there's one more. How was treatment deemed to be effective was one of the questions, and one response was, I didn't die. I thought that was quite interesting and quite funny.